Richard rubbed his stocking-covered foot beneath his desk as he looked over the work of one of his managers. The sensual feeling helped make the task seem less tedious to him. He then heard a knock on the door. He quickly put his foot down and forced it into his shoe as his secretary walked towards his desk. "Here's the expense report you wanted, Mr. Williams," Joan said as she placed the report on his desk. "Thank you, Joan," Richard replied before Joan walked out of the room. Richard stared at her as she walked away. He loved everything about her appearance. Richard believed that she had perfected the look for a secretary. She had her long brown hair that was tied back in a ponytail and had 3-inch heel pumps on. She wore an above-the-knee skirt, a tight blouse and black sheer pantyhose. Richard badly wanted to dress like her, but his job would not permit it. He knew that he would only be able to pull off her look in the privacy of his home with the makeup and outfits he kept there. It was a fantasy his wife let him play out at home. Dee did not mind it. She rather liked his other hobby of dressing up in women's clothing to clean the house on the weekends. Since it gave her some free time, she accepted his rationale that cleaning was women's work, so he must look like one to do it. The free time was something that Dee needed. She had started a company with her husband many years earlier. The company was a temp agency that primarily sent out secretaries to its clients. The company had expanded rapidly and made the two owners a fortune beyond what they ever anticipated making. They went into the business hoping to make a living, but, instead, it made them wealthier than they ever imagined becoming. With the increased wealth came an increased workload as the company became a behemoth. The original plan between Dee and Richard had become draining on her. When they began the company, it was settled that Dee would be the saleswoman, face and brains of the company, while Richard recruited workers and ran the day-to-day affairs of the business. However, as the company grew larger than they expected, most of Richard's work was passed on to managers. Richard was left with managing his managers. Dee's job description changed as well. While she remained the face of the company, she no longer solicited clients for it. However, the original clients still came to her. She put up with them because she had to. Dee had subsequently taken over more responsibilities at the company. She was the head of the company in practice, even though Richard was an equal partner in the company. Richard felt no need to contest their roles. He was perfectly happy letting Dee run the company while he did the little work he was given. Richard had to admit to himself that Dee was a better leader than he was. She had a stronger spine and was more of a taskmaster. From her pantsuits to her 4-inch heel pumps, everything about her screamed power to Richard. It was one of the reasons their relationship worked. She was naturally dominant, and he was naturally suited to wanting to please her. It was Dee that first suggested to Richard that he take over cleaning the house as the disparity of their workload became evident to both of them. She was willing to believe her husband's ridiculous explanation to give himself an opportunity to dress up. In fact, watching him clean dressed in a house dress and tights became one of her favorite things to do. She loved watching him tend to the house like a good housewife. It was her enjoyment of it that stopped her from hiring a cleaning service for the house despite the fact the couple could easily afford it. Richard was happy that Dee enjoyed his cleaning. He loved it as well. It made him feel delightfully femme as he did it. He took great pleasure in trying to make himself the perfect housewife outside of work. Dee appreciated that as well. She enjoyed having an obedient man take care of her and attend to her every need. While Richard and Dee initially tried to hide his cross-dressing and submissive nature from their employees, it quickly became an open secret. The workers noticed that Richard never contradicted Dee and seemed to be outright subservient to her. It was not long after Richard came to work with 2 studs in his ears to help facilitate his cross-dressing that the news got out about him. The office workers did not have much to say about the issue. It became well known that Richard was a cross-dresser, but the mostly female staff kept their amusement about that fact to themselves. No one wanted to cross Dee, so they did not dare to mock Richard. One male worker decided to try to seduce Dee by showing her the difference between a real man and her husband, but she laughed him out of her office and promptly terminated him. No male employee ever dared to try to get between Richard and Dee again after that. Their company also continued to grow and had recently started a cleaning agency subsidiary. Richard did not see the point of continuing to grow into another area, but Dee's desire to diversify the company's business won out. Richard knew that Dee wanted it, so he agreed to the expansion. The expansion did not affect him anyway. The workers in the subdivision were accountable to a manager that he did not control, Edward. Edward was only responsible to Dee. He became the only manager that reported to her alone because of the setup of the corporate subsidiary. The new subsidiary sent crews of cleaning ladies out to clean office buildings, and there was a quick expansion into the market for house cleaning as well. After only a year, the division became profitable. Richard often wondered if he should have taken control over the new division and made it his own, but its success told him that it was best that he remain in a less critical position. Richard heard a knock on his door as he looked over the expense report and saw Joan staring at him. "Can I have a moment, sir?" "Of course," Richard replied as he began to feel a little hot. He smiled up at Joan as he took off his jacket. As Richard sat with his back against the evening sunlight, Joan then saw something through his shirt. "Oh, my God," she said. Richard looked at the employee he had only hired 2 weeks before and asked, "What's wrong?" "There's something beneath your shirt." Richard knew what she was talking about. He knew he was wearing a teal camisole beneath his white shirt. However, he was certain that Joan must have heard from her coworkers that he was a cross-dresser. He smiled at her and asked, "Whatever are you talking about?" Joan closed the door and said, "You're wearing a camisole." Richard blushed and nodded. Joan shook her head and said, "You're one of those fags." Richard looked at her, shocked by her response. He could not believe that no one had told her about his cross-dressing. He thought about firing her on the spot, but he decided to give her a chance to redeem herself. "I beg your pardon," Richard responded after the shock left his face. Joan smirked and said, "You heard me. I can't believe you would do something like this. You perv. What if I told your wife?" "Oh, no, don't do that," Richard said with fake panic in voice. Joan failed to realize that he was not being serious and continued, "Oh, I won't tell her, but you'll have to do what I say from now on. Do you understand, bitch?" "Bitch," Richard replied, struggling not to laugh at his would-be extortionist. "Yes, that's what you are now. You're my bitch. Do you understand?" Richard nodded, feeling extremely turned on by Joan's dominance. He decided to play out his fantasy a little more before he fired her. "Are you wearing anything else that you shouldn't be?" "Just stockings, panties and garters," Richard admitted. Joan shook her head and said, "You're truly a disgusting pervert." "Maybe I need a spanking," Richard answered with a smile he could not contain. Joan's face turned red before she calmly responded, "I let that slide, perv, but here's what you have to do. You're going to let me be the boss in our relationship when your wife is not around. For all intents and purposes, you'll be my secretary, and I'll be your boss. That way we'll finally be going by the natural order of things." Richard thought about the terms of her attempt at blackmail. He wanted to play along and was sure that he could explain it to his wife and employees. He put his head down submissively and said, "I'll do it, just don't tell my wife." "Good," Joan responded before the door flung open behind her. Dee walked in and stared down at Joan before she said, "It's time to go, Richard." "Yes, dear," Richard said as placed on his jacket. Joan smirked at him as he walked by her. Richard could not wait to tell his wife all about it in the car. As Dee drove him home that night, Richard smiled at her and said, "Joan is trying to extort me." "What?" Dee asked with a laugh. "She noticed my cami and said she was going to tell you that I was a tranny unless I let her be my boss." "Why didn't she look more upset then?" "Oh, I didn't fire her." "You didn't? What are you waiting for?" Dee yelled. Richard put his head down and said, I thought it would be more fun if I played along. I might get some satisfaction out of it if I screwed with her. We could call the others and tip them off about it. I just thought, I'm sorry, Dee. I'll take care of it first thing tomorrow. No. I'm sorry, Richard. I shouldn't have yelled. I should have known that you had some little plan in your cute little head to get her back. Why don't you tell me all about it? Well, I was thinking about dressing up as a secretary tomorrow and… I don't know about that, Richard. I mean, you make a cute little lady and all, but playing a part around the house is different from the office. I know that they know about you, but they haven't seen it. This could cause some of them to lose some respect for you. Richard smirked at her and said, They all think I'm a pussy-whipped drag queen already. I bet they only listen to me because you're there to scare the hell out of them. Dee smiled and said, Okay, you may have a point about that. What are you going to do once you show up? I'm going to play the part of her secretary. Okay, you got me, Richard. How does that screw with Joan? She doesn't know I'm going to work in a skirt tomorrow. We surprise her with that, and we just keep going. We can get some of the staff involved and we can really fluster her all week. Week? I thought this would be for a day, at most. No. We need her to think everyone's on board with this, and that I had told everyone I was doing it as part of a bet with her. That'll make letting go of her at the end of the week even more of a surprise to her. Dee smirked and said, That's a bit cruel of you. That's not the sweet boy I married. However, I get where you're coming from on this. That little bitch deserves it, so I'm going to go with whatever you want to do here. Richard thanked his wife as she continued driving to their house. He could not wait for the next day. Dee was well aware of that fact as she occasionally peered over at him. She knew that the real reason behind Richard's cross-dressing at the office had nothing to do with Joan. She was just a convenient excuse for him. While she had her worries about how it would go over when she called her employees, she decided the risks were minimal and that it would make her husband happy. Richard awoke the next morning with a spring in his step. He got up before Dee and was showered and ready for his day before she had even got out of bed. He rushed around their home in a black skirt suit and black, patent leather heels as he made breakfast for the both of them. Dee smiled at him as she saw him placing the meal on the table. She nodded to herself and said, That's definitely the right outfit for your first day, dear. You really look quite, professional in it. Thanks, Richard said as pushed his hands against the bottom of his jacket. Dee took a seat and began to eat. Richard joined her and they talked as they read different parts of the morning paper. Dee asked Richard, Are you really sure you want to do this? Do you not want me to? Richard asked. Dee smiled and said, That's not what I asked. I'm not the one who's going to be living with the consequences. It's all on you. Richard crossed his legs and answered, I'm sure I want to do this. Richard and Dee left their house after breakfast and arrived at the office early, like they usually did. The other workers filed in unusually early to get a look of their boss en femme. Some laughed and joked with him, others were visibly disturbed by his appearance. However, the novelty of his appearance passed before Joan arrived at her normal time. Joan walked into the office and looked around. She saw Richard talking to Dee and froze. Joan stared at Richard with a look of shock. Dee smiled at it and said, I bet you didn't think he'd be this pretty when you made the bet. Bet? Joan began to ask, but was cut off by Dee. Yes, the bet that Richard told me about. I can't believe you got the better of him. I don't think it's really a win for you though. You're in for a lot more work, working his position than yours for the week. Joan looked at Richard and was uncertain of what was happening. Her threat of exposure had passed. It was obvious to her that Richard obviously come out to his wife as a cross-dresser, but for some reason Richard was still acting as if he was abiding by her threat. She then realized that Richard looked nervous. She began to wonder if maybe his wife did not understand the true reason behind his cross-dressing that day. Joan answered Dee, yes, of course the bet. You're so right. I know it's a lot of work, but that's what I signed up for when I made the bet. Oh, I just hope you won't be over your head and try not to run in too ragged this week. Joan nodded before Dee continued, all right, I leave you two alone. I've got my own work to do. Joan looked at Richard as Dee walked into her office and closed her door. Richard looked at her and asked, What? What? Are you kidding me? What? Joan asked in a low, frantic voice. I don't know what you want. Why the hell are you in a skirt? I thought you wanted me to. No. I was going to tell her about your CD fantasies if you didn't go along with what I said. I didn't want you to live them out. I'm not. She thinks this is all an act, Richard said, managing to keep a smile off his face. So she doesn't know about it. Good, I'll keep it that way, but you better find a way to maintain the lie so we can keep our new positions, Mr. Williams. Oh, I can't call you that, now, can I? I suppose not, Joan. You can't call me that either. I'm Miss Sterling to you, and you're my little secretary, Trisha. Trisha, yes, I like that. It's trampy sounding, just the name a little queer like you needs. You're Trisha, now. Do you understand me? Yes, Miss Sterling, Richard answered with a smile as he felt his member squirming in his gaff as he accepted the orders of his former subordinate. Good, now, I'm going into my office now. I want you to bring me a cup of coffee, 2 sugars 1 milk, pronto. Yes, Miss Sterling, Richard answered with a smile. Joan shook her and walked away from him. She could not believe how much he seemed to be enjoying being her secretary. Richard walked over to the coffee machine and deliberately put only 1 sugar into Joan's cup. He brought it over to his office and knocked upon the door, which was open. Joan smiled and said, You may enter. Richard said, Here's your coffee, Miss Sterling, as he entered. He placed it on the desk. Joan quickly picked up and took a sip. She recoiled a bit and said, This has 2 sugars in it? Oh, no, Miss Sterling, I only put 1 in. I asked for 2. You can't even get a simple coffee order right? Joan shrieked. I'm very sorry, Richard said, blushing as he felt a surge of pleasure go through him as he heard her berate him. Go fix this. Yes, Miss Sterling, Richard answered as he took hold of the cup. He scurried over to the machine again and skirt constricted steps with a full erection between his legs. He had never been more turned on than he was at that moment. Richard placed in the sugar packet and returned the cup to Joan. After she took a sip and found the coffee to her liking, she ordered to him to go to her desk and take care of the paperwork in his inbox. Richard nodded, and he complied with her command. As Richard filled out forms for Joan, one of his managers walked into her office. Hey, Joan. I heard about your bet with the boss. Oh, yes, I totally got the better of him, Joan replied to Steve with a smile. I got to say you've got some guts betting him. Why? Well, you know, Mrs. Williams. What about her? She's skinned more than a few people who have done Mr. Williams wrong. Are you serious? Joan asked. Steve noticed the slight worry in her voice and answered, Sure am. I remember when she drove that poor guy out of the state for saying something crass to him. Joan's face fell. She began to look for a way out. She smiled at Steve and said, Do you have anything you need to tell me? I've got a lot of work to do. I'm sure you do. I've got some more for you here. It's just some reports that you need to look over and critique for about a dozen employees. Get to it when you can, but Mr. Williams is scheduled to get them back to me by the end of the day tomorrow. Of course, Joan said with a forced smile as she took the files from Steve's hand. After Steve left her office, Joan got to her feet and peered out her door. Trisha, could you come in here for a minute? Richard heard the fear in her voice and smiled. He walked in and said, Can I take a seat? Of course, Joan said as she sat behind her desk. Richard crossed his legs and put his hands over his knees. He tried to present himself as effeminately as he could as he waited for Joan to speak. Joan's hand to tremble as she said, "I think we should swap back." "Oh, I could never convince my wife that you backed out of the deal." "You must." "Or what?" You'll what?" "You told me you'll tell her if I don't do it." "That was before. I've come to, oh, boy." "Miss Sterling, are you all right?" "I'm fine, I just need you to." "Miss Sterling, I can't do what you're asking." If I told her I went back to being the boss before the week was up, she'd know something was up. She'd either find out about me or she'd think I was breaking the deal. That would only end up making me work this job a little longer. "Is that what you want?" "I don't know," Joan said. "Well, Miss Sterling, I have work to do, and I see you do as well. So, let me cut to chase. For the rest of the week, neither one of us is going anywhere. Do you understand?" "Yes, Mr. Williams," Joan answered. "Mr. Williams?" "And Tricia this week, Miss Sterling," Richard answered with a smile before he got up and left the room. Richard sat down at his secretary's desk and typed up a few forms before he went to ask Joan what she wanted for lunch. Richard walked over to her open office door and knocked. He peered inside and saw Joan shaking a little as another one of his managers leaned on his desk. "Miss Sterling, I need to know what you want for lunch." "They're taking the orders now." In a cracking voice, Joan gave her answer. Richard wrote it down and gave it to the girl who made the office's lunch orders. As he sat down, he saw the manager coming out of Joan's temporary office. She smiled down at Richard and said, "Joan, looks like she's going to die. I just gave her more busy work, and she looked like she was going to faint. I told her all about how your wife doesn't tolerate employees failing behind on their work." "What did she say?" Richard asked Caitlin. "When I told Joan that she asked what your wife does, and I told her she fires people in no time, regardless of the circumstances." Richard smiled and Caitlin walked away to get back to her work. After lunch, Dee came by and called Joan out of her office. Joan came out with her head down. She looked ready to be eviscerated by Dee. Dee smiled at her and said, "How's your day been going?" "Good, ma'am." "Ma'am? I don't like to be called that." "Sorry, Ms. Williams." "Apology accepted." "Now, how has my husband been performing for you?" "Very good, Ms. Williams. He's been great, and I've been treating him well." "I'm sure you would. As a secretary yourself, you know how hard those in that position have it. I suppose it's not any harder than Mr. Williams' regular job." "Probably not, but he definitely seems to be enjoying this one better. Isn't that right, dear?" "Absolutely," Richard answered with a smile. Joan looked at him and wondered if he was using her blackmailing of him to live out his own fantasy. She wondered if he had set her up and wanted to see if he could trap someone else in his old job while he did what he wanted to. Dee then dismissed herself and went back to her office. Joan went to ask Richard about his intentions when Richard told her that a file she needed was by the door. Richard walked up to it, careful to sway his hips as girlishly as he could since he knew that Joan was watching him. Joan looked at him walk and knew that he was enjoying being her secretary. She tried to formulate a plan to recalibrate her extortion attempt in her head. As Richard walked by the front door with the file in his hand, he saw the door swing open. Richard looked at the small man walking through the door. He was only 5 feet 5 inches, but he had a booming voice. He asked Richard, "Hello, I'm Henry Phillips. I'm here to see Dee." "Where is she?" "Do you have an appointment?" "I don't need one. I know her personally." His answer intrigued Richard, but he did not elaborate. He just asked, "Where is she?" "In her office," Richard answered as he pointed towards Dee's secretary, Jane. The man walked towards her door, and the secretary smiled and asked, "How are you, Mr. Phillips?" "We spoke on the phone." "I'm good." "What's with that girl staring at us?" Henry asked as he pointed at Richard. Richard quickly put his head down and got to work. "Oh, she's new. She's a very good secretary though. We pulled her out of our temps," Jane said. "Really? How good is she?" "She's one of the best we've." "She's the girl I need then." "Sir, I don't think." Jane began to respond before Dee's door opened. "Henry, how are you?" Dee asked as she stepped out of her office. Henry smiled and said, "I'm good. I need one your secretaries for the rest of week. My girl went down with the flu." "Oh, yes. We can get you a temp tomorrow," Dee answered as she peered over at Richard and noticed that he was trying to listen into their conversation. "That's good. Can I make a request?" "Sure, if we can accommodate it, we will." "Good. I want that girl over there. I think Jane told me her name is Trisha." "Oh, you don't want her, Henry," Dee answered. "Why not? I keep hearing she's doing a great job." "Well, I won't take no for an answer. I only need her for the rest of the week anyway." Dee smiled at Richard before she turned to Henry and said, "I'll send her over first thing tomorrow." Richard looked at her with his concern evident on his face. Dee then said, "Trisha, can you come over here for a moment?" Richard stood up and walked towards his wife. She smiled at him and said, "There's been a change of plans. From the look on your face, I guess you overheard us?" "Yes, Ms. Williams," Richard answered, catching himself before he called his wife by her first name. "So you know that you'll be finishing this week working for Mr. Phillips?" Richard nodded slowly. Henry smiled at him and said, "Great. I look forward to having you at work tomorrow." Richard smiled and said he looked forward to it before Henry gave him his office's address. Richard took it with a smile before Henry exited the building. As he left, Dee turned away from Richard and headed into her office. She closed the door behind her and left Richard to wonder what she was thinking. He was a little shocked by his wife's agreement to transfer out his services. He could not understand why she would agree to it under any circumstances. He had to know what she was up to. Richard walked over to her door and gently knocked on it. "Who is it?" Dee asked. "Dee, it's Richard." "Come on in, Trisha," Dee replied. Richard was a little surprised to hear her use the name the others in the office were told to call him. He opened up her door and walked inside. He looked down at Dee, who was sitting behind her desk, which was covered in paperwork. Dee peered up at him as Richard asked, "Why did you tell that man that I would work for him tomorrow?" "Because you will, Trisha." "Have you?" TSK, Trisha. "You have to learn your manners, girl." "Oh, just drop the act for a minute, Dee." Dee smiled and said, "Well, what's your problem?" "I already told you." "What could you have been thinking?" "I was thinking about you, dear." "What?" "Oh, come on. Like I didn't notice that smile you've been sporting around here since you started dressing up as Trisha. Or maybe you think I haven't noticed how horny you've been in the bedroom since you started doing it. I'm just giving you a little more of what you want. But I don't know if I can do it for real. I don't know if you can either. Henry's a small client. He's kind of demanding too. So, if you screw up and we lose his account, it won't be the worst thing in the world. If you do good, well, that's gravy. I can't. Not with that attitude. You need to get positive, baby. I want you to go out tomorrow and enjoy being the secretary you want to be." "I'm enjoying it here," Richard admitted. "I know, but here you're protected from the realities of your position. There's nothing to help you with Henry. You're the only employee in that office. All of his other workers are out in the field. It's just you and a difficult boss. I think you're going to love it." Richard smiled at the thought. It was often a fantasy of his to be a secretary and being bossed around. He began to feel aroused and asked Dee, "What do we tell Joan?" Just tell her the truth. Actually, I'll do it. Richard nodded and followed Dee to Joan's office door. She knocked upon it and walked inside. Joan stared up at her like a deer caught in the headlights. She was sure that Richard had told Dee everything and that Dee was there to fire her. Dee, however, smiled and said, "Joan, I'm going to have to take my husband away from you for a little while." "Why?" "One of our clients saw him working, and he just had to have him for the week. We're going to give you a temp secretary for the week. I hope that's not a problem." "No. It's no problem," Joan answered. Richard smiled at her. She was visibly nervous around Dee. Dee then walked out of the room and left Richard and Joan alone. "What's going on?" Joan demanded to know. "It's like she said. I didn't want the job, but the client wouldn't take no for an answer." Joan put her hands on her head and told him to get out. She had never thought that she would have as much trouble doing Richard's work as she was. She figured that it was easy, however, she quickly realized that she was in over her head. She never knew how many things got passed off to Richard. In reality they did not, but Richard's managers were creating fake work to inundate Joan with. She was becoming visibly frazzled by the workload. She was planning to pass the work off to Richard the next day, and, now, she knew that that plan was shot too. Richard finished up his workday and went home with Dee. Dee had checked in with Joan before she left and smiled at the clearly overburdened woman who had tried to blackmail her husband. She felt that her husband's punishment for her was working out quite nicely for all of them. When Richard reached his house, he took off his shoes and went about cooking a nice dinner for Dee. It was a normal thing for him to do in the household. The only difference was the clothing he wore when he was making the meal. He always wore his work clothes when he started a meal, and then he would get dressed in his around-the-home clothing after the meal started cooking. Dee watched Richard start the meal. She smirked at his outfit and said, "Don't get changed." Richard knew what she wanted from him after dinner. He was turned on about getting the chance to be a secretary, and Dee knew that she was going to have an eager lover that night. The next morning, Richard arose and dressed in another skirt suit. It was a gray suit with a pencil skirt. He paired it with a pair of black pumps and sheer black pantyhose. As he styled his hair for the first day of his temporary employment with a male boss, he took special care to make sure that he neatly tied it back in a low ponytail. Dee saw him as he got ready and said, "Don't be too much of a tart for him." "I don't want you leaving me." Richard smiled and said, "You know that would never happen." "Neither would a three-way with Henry," Dee countered. Richard shook his head with a smile before he started to apply his foundation. He added some mascara, eyeliner and blush before he went and took hold of his purse. He placed it by the front door and then made breakfast for himself and Dee. After they ate, Richard walked into the bathroom and put on red lipstick. He then went to kiss Dee goodbye, but she stopped him and said a hug will do. "I don't want to be washing lipstick off my cheek, dear." Richard nodded and hugged her. Dee smiled and said, "Good luck today. I hope it's everything you fantasized, well, almost everything." Richard smiled at her and walked out of the front door. He hurried to his car, hoping the neighbors would not see him. Richard got into the driver's seat and started the car. Driving to work felt strange to Richard. He had not driven to work in 10 years since he always carpooled with his wife. Dee did not like Richard's driving. She felt he drove too slow and frequently told him that he was an 80-year-old woman trapped in a 35-year-old man's body. Richard would smile at the remark because he felt it was accurate except for the former age. Richard also felt odd driving in heels. He had never done it before. While it took some getting used to at first, he quickly got used to it. He pulled into the parking lot at Henry Phillips's offices building. It was a sleek-looking building that contained well over 25 offices. Richard took a step inside and found out which office was Henry's. He then walked over to the glass door he saw Henry walking around behind. He pushed open the door and said, "Hello, Mr. Phillips. How are you, Tricia?" "I'm good, you?" Same. Are you ready to work? Wouldn't be here if I wasn't, Mr. Phillips. Glad to hear it, doll. Doll, Richard repeated in his head. A smile came upon his face as he thought about what Mr. Phillips must think of his secretary and other secretaries. Do you know how to make coffee? Absolutely, Mr. Phillips. Then start there. Richard nodded as Mr. Phillips receded into his office. Richard walked over to the coffee machine and made a pot of coffee. As he waited for it to brew, he began looking over the documents on the secretary's desk. When he heard that the coffee was ready, Richard sprung to his feet and knocked upon Henry's door. Mr. Phillips, how would you like your coffee? Milk, sugar. Richard nodded and went over to the coffee to make a cup of coffee for Henry. He followed Henry's direction and placed it in the milk. He was not sure how much milk he wanted, and that made Richard a little nervous. When he finished, he walked the cup over to Henry and placed it on his desk. Henry smiled and took a sip before he spit it back into the cup. That's the milkiest thing I ever drank. I'm sorry, Mr. Phillips. Make me another cup, Henry demanded. Richard's heart started to race as he felt a wave of arousal wash over him as Henry berated him. Richard walked back over to the coffee maker and made Henry another cup of coffee. He brought it back over to him and placed it on his desk. Henry glared at Richard as he took hold of the cup. He took a sip and said, "This is acceptable." Richard nodded and walked out of the room. As Richard sat down, he felt his enlarged manhood being squashed between his cheeks. While Richard was excited over how he was treated by Henry, he was a little concerned that other temps were treated that way by the man. Berating women over judgment calls was not something Richard looked highly upon. However, he knew he was in no place to change Henry's behavior. As Richard began to make copies of documents for Henry, Henry walked out of his office and threw documents upon Richard's desk. He looked at Richard and said, "Tricia, type these up pronto." "Yes, Mr. Phillips." Richard scurried over and began to type up the forms. He had never been the fastest typist in the office. He had a moderate proficiency at it, but that was it. Henry walked out and said, "Are you done yet?" "I have a few pages left, Mr. Phillips." "Are you joking?" Henry asked with a stern face. "No, sir," Richard answered as he put his head down and tried to type faster. "I can see that Jane greatly oversold your talents," Henry said before he receded back into his office. "What a dick," Richard thought to himself. As Richard continued typing, he heard the phone ring. He picked up and said, "Phillips Construction, this is Tricia speaking. How may I help you?" "This is Trevor Winston. Is Mr. Phillips available?" "One moment, sir." Richard called into Mr. Phillips's office. "Mr. Phillips, a Mr. Winston is on the phone and would like to speak with you." "Tell him I'm busy. Get his numbers and tell him I'll call him back." Richard then went back and spoke to Mr. Winston. "Mr. Winston, I'm sorry Mr. Phillips just stepped out. Can I get your number so he can call you back?" Mr. Winston grumbled and gave Richard the number before he abruptly hung up. Richard was surprised by the discourteous treatment he received on the phone from Mr. Winston. After he finished fielding the call, he went back to typing the documents Henry had given him. When he finished, he brought the documents to Henry. Henry took them and gave Richard a glare as he watched him walk out of his office. Richard felt a little exposed as he walked out. He did not look where he was going and his leg hit a file cabinet. Richard looked down and saw the run in his pantyhose. Henry shook his head and said, "Go change your pair." "I forgot to pack a spare," Richard replied. "Are you kidding, Missy?" Henry said, unable to hide his disgust. "No, Mr. Phillips." "Stand there," Henry ordered. Richard did so as Henry dialed a number. "Hello, Jane, this is Henry Phillips. No, everything is not fine. I need to speak with Dee right away." Richard overheard Jane say, "One moment please," as Henry put the call on speakerphone. "Hello, Dee said. Dee, this is Henry Phillips. Can you explain to me why you sent this useless temp to work for me? I didn't want to. I have a good mind to drop your company over this. Henry, I tried to tell you about. Listen, I know that I insisted upon Trisha, but you should have explained to me that she was too incompetent to even pack a change of pantyhose. Richard heard Dee snicker and blushed. He knew that Dee found that foolish decision as amusing as he found it arousing. He loved listening to Henry detail his failings. Finally, Dee replied, we'll send some else over today. Just send Trisha back to us to deal with. You've got it. Have a nice day. You too, Henry. Henry hung up the phone and said, you heard your boss. Now, make like a tree and get out of here. Richard nodded and collected his belongings. He drove to his company's office. He parked in the lot and stared up at the building. He was a little afraid to walk into it and find out what the others would think when they found out that he had failed as a secretary. He most especially wondered about Dee. She knew that he had always wanted to be one. He wondered what she would think now that she knew he could not cut it as one. After taking a few deep breaths, Richard stepped out of his car and walked towards the building's door. He walked in and went to the elevator and pushed the button for the company's third-floor office. His stomach felt uneasy as the elevator went up and dinged at his floor. He stepped off and took small steps towards the office door. He closed his eyes as he drew it open and walked inside. He walked through the office and heard a few snickers he was sure were directed at him despite not having any proof of that. He walked over to where his office was and saw a temporary secretary sitting at Joan's customary desk. Jane saw him and called him over to her. She looked at him and said, was that guy as big of jerk as he sounded? You have no idea, Richard replied. Your wife's not even sure she wants his business anymore. I don't want any of our girls working for a guy like him. He's a bore. Dee overheard their conversation and opened up her door. She called her husband inside. Richard walked in and took a seat. Dee looked at him and said, how's that fantasy working out for you? Richard blushed and said, it's harder to be a secretary than I thought. You're inexperienced. You'd do better if you put in the time. You also went in and worked for a boss with unrealistic expectations of you. You can blame Jane for that. Richard nodded and said, I saw the secretary in Joan's spot. Can you get rid of her by tomorrow? No. She's going to stay there for the week. That's what we promised her. So you're firing Joan today? No. You have your plan, so we'll wait until Friday for that. Well, what about me? Richard asked. We'll find something for you. Let me just call in Joan. Maybe she can find some work for you to do. I can't do her work for her, you know. Oh, I wouldn't let her push it off on you. She's just the number 2 around here for the week, so I've got to keep up appearances and let her get her voice in. Richard found the explanation reasonable. Joan came into the office a few minutes later and said, what can I do for you, Mrs. Williams? Joan looked down at Richard and thought he had given her up. However, Dee answered, Richard was let go by Henry today. So, we need to find him some work. Do you have any suggestions? Well, I could use. You could use him? You already have a secretary. Yes, but I could use the. If you're an overhead, resign now. If you need his help, you've got to go, Dee answered coldly. Joan's face went white and she said, I don't need him. I don't know if any of my managers do either. I could ask? Dee shrugged and said, I'm sure they can take care of themselves. Joan then smiled and said, well, what about the cleaning service? You could send him out as a temp to the service. Richard shot Joan a dirty look. While the idea of cleaning with the company intrigued him and excited him, he did not want his wife to know he would be willing to do it. Dee leaned back as she contemplated the idea and she said, you know, Edward said one of his crews needs another girl. That's a great idea, Joan. That's where we'll put her. Joan smiled and said, "Thank you for your praise, Mrs. Williams." "You're welcome, dear. Now, get back to work." Joan nodded and left the room. Richard then stood up and closed Dee's office door. He walked back towards her and said, "What the hell was that about?" "What? You need a job for the rest of the week. This is going too far. I can't even screw with." "Oh, don't worry about Joan. I've got more than enough people undermining her and making her paranoid without you around here. Listen, dear, I'm just playing along with this game that you created." "I know, but Good, now, go down to see Edward on the second floor and get fitted for a uniform. I'll call him and tell him you're coming. But no questions, dear. We don't have all day. After he's done with you, you can take the rest of the day off. See if you can make a turkey dinner tonight." "Yes, dear," Richard replied as he walked out of the room a bit confused about what was going on. He went to the elevator and wondered what Dee's real aim was. He knew that she was more than aware that being a cleaning lady would excite him. He wondered if this was a plan of hers to let him experience it without having him beg for the chance to do it. Another part of him wondered if this was part of some larger plan of Dee's. He wondered if Joan was just a pawn in Dee's game. He could not figure out what his wife was up to as the elevator door drew open. He went over to the cleaning company's office door and opened it. He saw a secretary who smiled and said, "You must be Tricia?" Richard smiled and said he was. The secretary took him over to Edward and introduced him. Richard shook the strapping man's hand and said hello. Richard was impressed by how manly Edward was. Richard's hand practically disappeared into Edward's. He had broad shoulders and stood 6 feet 4 inches. He also had a crew cut and the sculpted body of a professional athlete. Edward said it was good to meet him and took down Richard's measurements with the secretary. Richard felt odd having their hands on him as they measured him for a uniform. A man had never touched him before and it embarrassed Richard. The embarrassment deepened for Richard by the fact that he was turned on being so effeminate around the picture of masculinity helping to wrap a tape measure around his waist. He liked comparing himself to Edward and feeling inadequate as a man as he stood before him a skirt and heels. When they finished, Edward sent the secretary to get 2 uniforms for the last 2 days of the week. Edward smiled at Richard and said, "So, Tricia, your wife has told me a lot about you?" "She has?" Richard blushed as Edward referred to him by his female name while also mentioning his wife. "Yes. She says you're a very skilled cleaner. Your skills are going to be tested tomorrow and Friday. I only hope you're up to the job." "I'm sure I am," Richard answered with his head down. "Now, tomorrow, the company is going to come by and pick you up in the morning." "What?" "Yes, we have a van that picks up each crew that's driven by the boss. Your boss is Juanita. She's a wonderful little Puerto Rican woman. She's a very fair boss, and her crews handle some of our largest clients' offices." "What time will they?" "They're going to arrive at your house at 6 a.m. sharp. So be ready then. Your shift is from 7 a.m. to 5 p.m. Your wife wanted you to work a day shift for some reason. Why do you have more work at night?" "Usually, but Juanita needed help too." The secretary then came out with the gray and white uniforms and handed them to Richard. Richard looked over the dresses, aprons, and the pair of white sneakers for a moment. The secretary then smiled at him and said, "Good luck tomorrow, Tricia." Richard thanked her before Edward added, "You're permitted to wear either nude or black sheer pantyhose or black or gray tights with your uniform. No other colors are permitted. Am I clear?" Richard nodded and said, "Yes, sir." He instantly regretted his docile answer, which prompted a smile on Edward's face. He shook his head and said, "You don't have to call me sir, Tricia. Your wife's my boss, and I guess, so are you." Richard nodded and said goodbye to Edward and his secretary. Richard walked out of the office and headed for the parking lot. He drove home and started dinner. He hung up his uniform and prepared himself mentally for the 2 days ahead. The next morning, Richard awoke early and dressed in his uniform. He paired the gray dress with a pair of black tights before he placed on his white apron. After breakfast, Richard waited by the door for the van to pull up. It came a little after 6. Richard rushed out the door as he heard his wife stirring from bed. He did not want her to see him in uniform. Richard hurried up to the van and saw 2 cleaning women sitting in the front 2 seats. Richard opened up the van's side door and climbed inside onto one of the bench seats. Juniata introduced herself and her subordinate Loretta. Richard introduced himself to them and they continued on their way to picking up their other cleaning women. As they drove, Juanita asked, "Why do you live in such a nice home and work with us?" Richard smiled and said, "Oh, I'm a live-in maid for the owners. They insisted I get a part-time job, so that's why I'm temping with you this week." The answer satisfied Juanita as she drove on. Richard felt that the van quickly seemed to become crowded. He was used to riding only with his wife, but now he was in close quarters with 5 women, 3 of whom were larger than him. Richard felt like blushing as they girls talked about breastfeeding and bad lovers while they made their way to their first job of the day. When they entered the office, Juanita divvied up the jobs. Richard was assigned to cleaning the bathrooms. He was told where the cleaning cart for the bathrooms was located. He was less than enthused with the assignment. He wanted to clean the offices, however, cleaning the bathrooms excited him to some degree. As he began to clean them, he began to experience a familiar arousal as he scrubbed the toilets. He felt very much like the woman he wanted to be as he did it. He mopped the floors and feared that his wife would find out just how much he was enjoying himself. After he finished, he met up with Juanita and was told to empty the trash cans. He set about doing so as he dragged the cart throughout the office. As they finished up with their first job, the office workers began filing in. The workers walked by the cleaning staff and ignored their presence. Richard felt excited being ignored rather than dealt with a great deal of deference. The crew then headed to their next job. As Richard cleaned the office, he felt continued to be aroused by what he was doing. He was cleaning in full view of those whose equivalents reported to him at his regular job. Richard felt as if he had been truly reduced to working the position of a cleaning lady. Juanita was generally pleased with his cleaning until she asked him to do windows. As he finished, Juanita walked up behind him and said, "That is not how we do windows." "What?" Juanita shook her head and pointed out the streaks. She said, "You must do better than this. Our company expects more of us and so do this client. Now, I'm going to show you how to do it, and you're going to follow my lead." Richard nodded and watched her clean the window. He then repeated her motion. Juanita nodded as he did it and said, "That's good, girl." Richard blushed at the praise and how good it made him feel. After they finished up the office, they did a few more jobs before Richard was taken home. He hoped that he would beat his wife home, but he arrived at 6:30, not long after Dee had gotten home. He walked up to the door and let himself in. He looked around for his wife and ran up the stairs. He headed for his bedroom, hoping not to be seen. He drew open the door and saw Dee waiting on the bed for him, dressed in a nightie. Richard blushed as she saw him dressed as a cleaning lady for the first time. My, you make a pretty maid, Tricia." Richard blushed again and said, "I'm actually a cleaning lady." Dee smirked and said, "Well, before you change, why don't you clean up the house a little while I make dinner?" Richard nodded and said, "What do you want done? Why don't you clean the dining room and the kitchen for me, while I make us a steak?" Richard smiled as he replied, "Of course, Mrs. Williams." Dee stood up and slapped Richard's rear before she walked down the steps. Richard followed behind her and began to clean as he heard Dee working in the kitchen. Richard looked forward to the meal. Dee was only able to cook a few things, and she only did so on special occasions when she felt that Richard needed a break from cooking. As Richard finished with the kitchen, Dee put the meal on the table and called for him to join her. Richard washed his hands and sat down at the table beside him. Dee put her foot up into Richard's lap. She worked it underneath his dress. She began to press the heel of her foot into Richard's untucked member. Richard smiled at her as he cut his steak and asked, "What are you doing, Mrs. Williams?" "Now, Tricia. I think Mrs. Williams is a little formal thing to call your wife. Why don't you call me mistress instead?" "Sure, mistress," Richard replied as his member surged only to be pressed against further by Dee as she chewed her food. "How was your day?" Dee asked. Richard told her what he had done. Dee listened with rapt attention as he detailed the mundane tasks he had completed. She smiled when he finished and told her about her own day. Richard listened as he heard her talk about her familiar tasks running their company. The difference of her day from his excited him. She was a boss, while he was only hired help to tidy up offices. After they finished, Dee took Richard up to their bedroom and forced down his tights. She made love to him while he was still dressed in his uniform. After her climax, Richard realized what Dee's angle was. He knew that she loved seeing him debase himself as much as he did. "This isn't healthy, but it feels so good," Richard thought to himself as Dee fell asleep beside him. The next morning, Richard awoke and dressed in the other uniform he had been given. He went to the jobs with Juanita's crew and waited anxiously to see what Dee had in store for him at the end of the day. However, as they drove to their last job, Richard recognized the surroundings. They pulled up in front of Dee's office building soon after. "What's going on?" Richard asked. "We had a different office added to the route this week on the boss's orders. Our crew was specially requested for the job." Richard nodded to himself as he wondered if the boss who asked was Dee or Edward. Either one of them would know how embarrassed he would be around his subordinates in a cleaning lady's uniform. However, Richard wondered if Edward somehow was trying to get with Dee and thought this would degrade him in his wife's eyes. Richard's fears were confirmed as Juniata pressed the button for the third floor. He knew he would be cleaning around his employees. The door opened up and Juanita assigned him to cleaning the waste baskets. While Richard knew that the job would be a quick one because most of the work was done by the overnight crew, he still knew that there was no chance he would not be recognized by his subordinates. He walked into the office and found a few amused faces staring at him as he cleaned. They asked him about his day as he made the rounds, dragging the garbage cart behind him. Joan smiled as she saw him and said, "You seem to make quite a good maid, Tricia." "I'm not a maid, I'm a cleaning lady," Richard countered coldly. He was surprised to see that his wife had not fired her already. He began to wonder if she was even planning to anymore. Juanita's crew finished cleaning and were ready to leave when Dee came out and told them to go home without Richard. Juanita was unhappy to hear that, but Dee informed her that she was Richard's household employer and would drive him home. That satisfied Juanita, who left the building with the rest of her crew. Dee opened her office door and motioned for Richard to go inside. She closed the door behind her and sat at her desk. Richard looked down at her and asked, "Why would you bring me here like this?" "Oh, don't pretend you didn't like it." Richard blushed at his wife's observance of his clear enjoyment of his humiliation. She smirked and continued, "I had to see for myself if this is what you need." "What do you mean?" "I heard how you talked about the job last night. You love it, and you're good at it. Unlike with your secretary fetish, you actually are good living this one out." Richard smiled at her praise and said, "Be that as it may, I have responsibilities here." "Your services are not necessary here, Richard. I can hire someone to do them. You're more valuable to our company working as a cleaning lady than you were at your old position." "Old position?" "Well, old if you don't want it anymore. But what about our lives? And we don't need the check you bring home. We have more than we'll ever need already, darling. It's time for you do what you love. I love running this company, you love to be bossed around by female superiors. I can only comfortably do the latter for you at home," Dee answered with a smile. "I don't know. Richard, I'm not asking you to give up your share of the company. You're not losing anything, but your pay and your position here. Wait, I'd be working for cleaning lady wages, yes. I couldn't pay you more than your bosses. That wouldn't be right. I suppose you're right, but what are you concerned about? Dee asked. What if I don't like it? Well, I've got other positions here you can move into. But what about my old one? Well, as a half-owner, you could put yourself back into it, if you really wanted to. Richard nodded as he thought about what she said. He knew it was his choice, and he had a way back if he made the wrong one. However, he knew that the window of opportunity to make that choice was short. He decided then to take it. Dee greeted his decision with a smile. She stood up and kissed him and said, I'm so happy for you. We'll go in just a minute, I have to take care of something. Richard nodded and took a seat as he waited for her. He heard screaming. He recognized the voice as Joan's. He heard pleading, and he heard his wife's loud and cold voice telling Joan to leave. He knew then that she was not involved in any plot Dee might have had. Dee walked back in and gave Richard a smile. Richard walked over to her and said, I love you, mistress. I love you too, Tricia.